But first, we wanted to welcome Laila Al-Arian to the program. An Emmy and Peabody award-winning journalist, Laila is the executive producer of Fault Lines, Al Jazeera's flagship investigative documentary series. She co-authored with Chris Hedges the book Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. And back in 2011, she produced Al Jazeera's groundbreaking work on the Palestine Papers, the largest ever leak of Palestinian Authority secret documents, which detailed their close collaboration with the Israeli occupation. Today, we'll be talking about The Night Won't End, the latest episode of Fault Lines, which is about Israel's genocidal war against the people of Gaza. Our colleague Asa wrote an article about The Night Won't End, which people can go to electronicintifada.net to read. It also includes the full video of the film, which is free to watch on YouTube. Laila, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Hi, Laila.
It's good to see you. And I think for anyone who watches The Night Won't End, will find it's not an easy watch. Myself, there were several times where I had to pause it and stand outside for a few minutes to collect myself. It takes us through the true scale of the destruction and the unprecedented extent of Israel's genocide in Gaza over the last 8 months. Can you talk about the premise of the documentary and how you identified the 3 families that are the focus of it?
Sure. Well, I should mention that by the time, Israel launched its onslaught on Gaza back in October, my program, Fault Lines, is a documentary program focused on the U.S. and its role in the world and based in D.C. By the time everything was happening in Gaza, I had already, commissioned everything for the fall season. So we have 2 seasons, fall and spring. So I just felt like I was kind of helplessly watching as a journalist, everything happening. I have family in Gaza. My mom actually found out in April, so the number could be higher now, that she lost over 200 members of her extended family in Gaza. They come from a big family. And I really wanted to cover it as a journalist. But of course, Israel has also barred journalists from entering Gaza. So that burden and responsibility of covering everything in Gaza has fallen solely on the shoulders of the journalists, the very brave journalists and resilient journalists in Gaza, who you've mentioned have been killed in horrifically record numbers. So we knew that for the spring season that we wanted to do something, ambitious, just given the scale of the destruction, the devastation, the suffering. And of course, you always, think about, like, where do I even begin? Every single day, there's a new horror. Nora, it took you 20 minutes just to go through. I'm sure it wasn't even everything,
right,
just in the last few days. And it's one horror after another. So, obviously this was months of this, and it's been ongoing months of this. So what my colleague Kavitha Shukuru and also Sharif Abdul Qudus, a journalist who's the reporter in the story, all worked on this together. And what we did was start to kind of identify some major cases. And we looked at, of course, airstrikes were the way that most civilians were being killed in Gaza. So it was very clear that we would have to cover an airstrike. And we looked at one that happened in December, on December 11th. And it took place in Gaza City. And the Salim family was sheltering. The family that we focus on had already been displaced from their home. It's unfathomable to think every single Palestinian family has been displaced at this point, and not just displaced once or twice, multiple times, time and again. And in fact, some of the families that we interview in the film have already been displaced since we interviewed them. So the Salim family survived. The family that we interview in the film survived an airstrike that killed more than 100 members of their family, of their extended family. And the daughters of that family were injured, some of them, in this attack. And the family then gets displaced yet again. And Hiba Salim, who's the matriarch of the family that we talked to, ends up taking her family to shelter with her brother in Sheikh Radwan in Gaza, in an apartment building there. And then this just blew my mind, but this is something that you see over and over and over again in Gaza, which is you survive one horrific massacre, one horrific incident, only to find that you're killed in another horrific incident. So really, there's no safe place in Gaza. There's no place to shelter, and there's no escaping Israeli attacks, whether they're from the air, whether they're artillery attacks, quadcopters, snipers, or executions by ground troops, which is what ended up happening to the Salem family yet again when Israeli ground troops came into their home and executed at least 11 men, including Hiba's husband, Ayman. So we focused on an airstrike, on an execution, on so-called safe zones. So this is something that the US likes to talk a lot about, which is, well, the Israelis gave Palestinians safe zones where they can go. And of course, what we show is that it's a myth. So many families who were told to flee to the south where it's so, quote unquote, safe, fled to the south only to find that their loved ones were killed. Their loved ones were killed anyway. And we tell the story of Abdullah al-Ghaf, which is why we wanted to focus on the safe zones, who is a father of 4 children. His youngest son, 2-year-old Firas, asked him for some biscuits one morning. The children were hungry because just like in the north, in the south, food was not available. And he went to the market to find biscuits for his son. And after he left, his family was killed. We think it was an artillery attack, although we've also received reports that it could have been an airstrike as well. It's possible it was both. They were sheltering in an apartment building across from Al-Amal clinic in Khan Yunis. And his son, Firas, was killed, and as well as his wife, Mariham. And you see the way we found out about this story is through a viral video in which Abdullah kisses his son as he's in his shroud after he was killed, and gives him the biscuits and says, I brought these for you. Here you go. It's just an absolutely heartbreaking moment. But our idea for the film was to kind of go beyond the cell phone videos, which we see every single day on social media, and to really try to take a step back and put the viewer in with these families so that they can really get a sense of what these families have experienced in their lives. And we also look at the case of, and there's a reason this is an hour and 20 minutes, which is one of the longest fault lines we've ever made. But we also look at the case, which is the most well-known out of all the cases. We look out of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl who, her mom also fled to the south on orders by the Israelis, quickly found out that the south wasn't safe. And it was something her mother told her that made her want to go back north where she's from, which is, Wissam, her name is Wissam. Her mom told her, Wissam, write your name on your arms in case you're killed and people can identify you. And this is something we've heard over and over again, including parents writing their children's names on their arms and legs. And she said, I wanted to go back to the north so that if I die, people will be able to identify me. And we kind of go through that whole horrific case and work with the UK nonprofit research organization, Forensic Architecture, to kind of forensically deconstruct what happened to Hind and her family.
And can you explain the process of how this film was made without being able to go to Gaza yourselves due to Israel's ban on journalists and the complete sealing off of any border crossings?
Yeah, so we worked with a Palestinian, very talented media company called Mediatown, which has been working in film and video production for many years, very professional. And they have a number of cinematographers and journalists on the ground in Gaza that we worked with who filmed with the families. And as we were doing our own reporting, because some of these stories are very detailed, and we needed to kind of make sure that we were collecting as much evidence as we could to back up our reporting. We also hired some local journalists that we found through social media. And I just want to say something about these journalists. They worked under the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances imaginable. Everything that people of Gaza are going through, they're going through, especially the journalists in the north we were working with. They were so hungry, so tired. I remember one of them told me at one point, he said that they shared one can of food, one can of beans among 10 men. one night. So they're working really hard. They're, carrying their gear and their cameras, and, malnourished, unable to eat or source food. They themselves are losing family members on a daily basis. Sometimes I felt like, everybody I was reaching out to had just lost someone or was dealing with some kind of crisis or another, and yet they were so responsive and professional and did the work. And just to give you a couple of examples, one of the cameramen, I was writing him, and he said, "I'm so sorry I haven't been responding to you, but I'm in so much pain on my leg because of an accident that I had before October." So of course, we know about the people who've been injured and unable to receive medical care, since October. But then there's people who've had injuries or illnesses or whatever it is who can't get any medical care since then. And then we had, I reached out to a journalist who was one of the people on the scene after Hind Rajab, her body was discovered, as well as that of the two paramedics. And he had filmed a US-made shell that was found by the ambulance. And I just wanted to ask him about filming that and all of that. And I was told, by the way, this is Mu'tasam al-Dallul. I was told, by the way, he just lost his wife and son just a few days ago. So he was still freshly grieving and mourning his family, trying to stay alive. And he writes me and says, "I'm so sorry for my late reply," but he was covering a flower massacre as I was writing him. So it was this is the kind of just unrelenting challenges and grief, and it's just unspeakable what they're going through. Yeah. And yet they did such a beautiful job with this film, working with us.
Laila, the film is extraordinary. I agree with Nora. It was very difficult to watch, but necessary to watch. And the reason that it was so difficult to watch is because, it only struck me when watching it, in comparison to so much other media I've had to see, that this film puts Palestinians at the center. You'd think that that's where they would be anyway, given that they're the victims of a Holocaust, the victims of a genocide. But it was extraordinary to see Palestinians telling what happened to them. And you did such an extraordinary job corroborating, I would say even over-corroborating their stories. The level of evidence in this film is extraordinary. And as you know, Laila, I look at a lot of the Israeli propaganda, the mass rapes films, and so on. So we pay close attention to the evidence, and it's all there. And as you mentioned, you look closely at the story of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl who was killed as she was desperately pleading on the phone to the Palestine Red Crescent Society to come and rescue her. And the videos of her last words were widely viewed online. And, her killing really struck people. She's one of what now, maybe 15, 20,000 children. The report says another 21,000 children are missing. So she's only one, but it touched people's hearts because, the sound of her own voice pleading for help reverberated around the world. We're not going to play that right now, but just to demonstrate how this film gives Palestinians really the chance to narrate what's happening to them. Let's take a look at this clip of Hind's mother, Wissam Hamada, speaking about what happened. I think it's extraordinary.
With airstrikes in the south, some families who had fled the north went back there, trying to find some form of safety, like Wissam Hamada. After fleeing to the south on orders from the Israeli military, she and her husband were separated.
أبويا وزوجي كانوا بسيارة تانية ما قدروش يصلوا للمكان اللي إحنا وصلنا له من شدة القصف. فمن الخوف صارت أمي تحكي لنا اكتبوا يما أسماءكم على إيدكم لو استشهدتوا يعرفوا أنتوا مين. أنا حكيت لها في هذا اللحظة من حد ما حكيت لأمي هذا الإشي، حكيت لها أنا يا أمي بدي أخذ أولادي وأرجع على غزة عشان لما أستشهد يعرفوا إني أنا وسام حمادة.
She came back to the north with her 2 children, Iyad and her 6-year-old daughter, Hind. They stayed with relatives, including Hind's 15-year-old cousin, Layan.
كانت تحكي لها لا أنا بدي أطلع جراحة، أنا بدي أحكم أكتر منك يا هنود. بتقولها طب أنت إلا أنت كوني طبيبة جراحة وأنا طبيبة أسنان ونفتح عيادة مع بعض.
But in the north, safety was impossible to find. Late on January 28th, there were heavy attacks by Israeli forces in Gaza City, near where Wissam and her children were staying with relatives.
أمامنا أحزمة نارية بشكل مرعب جدا لدرجة النار تخش على البيت اللي إحنا فيه. حاولنا نتوسط المنزل وبطلع في هنود بحكي لها يا هنود تعالي نامي عندي. هي مغمضة عينيها وأنا أطلع فيها أقول يا الله يا إمي ما أحلاكي معقول بدك تسيبيني يا هنود.
The next day, the family decided to leave once again in search of safety. It was cold and raining hard. Wissam's uncle Bashar left with his wife and children, including Layan. Hind went too.
حكى أنا بدي أخذ أولادي وولاد بنت أخويا أحطهم في السيارة ونتوجه لمنطقة أبعد من المنطقة فيها وبدي أرجع أخذكم. فحطينا أولادي في السيارة يد نط من السيارة بدوش يروح.
But soon after they left, Wissam says the car was fired on by Israeli forces.
Now, in this film, you, as I mentioned, you have the testimony from Palestinians, from Hind's family, but also the other families whose personal testimony is no less compelling. But you also do something else in the case of Hind Rajab. You feature forensic architecture, which is a research group that uses really sophisticated forensic techniques, and earshot, which uses sound analysis. And they show how they do their analysis in the film. And basically what they are able to show, they're able to determine that an Israeli tank nearby fired hundreds of rounds into the car where Hind was and her cousin Layan, who'd already been killed at that point. Hind was the last person alive. And you do this investigation, which is very compelling, but for some reason, the United States government, with all its resources, is unable to do the same thing. And State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller actually defends Israel's bogus version of events, despite all the evidence. I think we can actually take a look at Matthew Miller speaking. And I'm sorry to subject you to this, Laila, but you've probably seen worse. Let's take a look at Matthew Miller, the State Department spokesperson, reacting to the murder of Hind Rajab at a time when it was causing global outrage. Do we have that?
Maybe we don't have that.
Okay, maybe we don't have that. We can come back to it. But
well, I want to say something about this.
Yeah.
So Matthew Miller claimed yesterday, when journalists asked him about this, because, you know, there were some news lines not covered by the mainstream media, but covered by other alternate sources, that, you know, he was presented with the new facts about the number of bullet holes found in Hind's car. And he said, well, Israeli soldiers told us that they weren't there at the time, which of course that's absurd. I mean, there's satellite imagery of you know, Israeli tanks. Hind herself, a 6-year-old girl, and Layan are both saying there's tanks. I mean, it's just like completely ridiculous at this point to try to repeat that lie. And then he says, well, they've tried to reach out to the Palestine Red Crescent, and I forget the other, or maybe it was the UN, and neither of them got back to them. And of course, you know, Prem Thacker from The Intercept reached out to the Palestine Red Crescent, and they said, we never heard from them. Right. So they're just lying repeatedly, and he's repeatedly, you know, acting as a stenographer for them, not even questioning anything they're saying. And I should mention, I mean, you said like you guys did this investigation, the US could. With Shireen Abu Aqla, a US citizen, we went and we spoke with all of the eyewitnesses, her colleagues who were with her. We did, you know, extensive interviews with them for a documentary that my program did as well. And then the US continued under the Biden administration, continued to defer to the Israeli investigation. And then when we asked those same eyewitnesses, did the Israeli military speak with you? They all said no. What kind of investigation doesn't include interviews with the main eyewitnesses who were there? So, I mean, that tells you all you need to know about these Israeli investigations that the US is continually deferring to.
Yeah. And can I just say that just because earlier we had the clip of Wissam Hamada, Hind's mother, talking, and it was in Arabic with subtitles, but just for those who are listening, Wissam Hamada was talking about the what happened on that day, how the family decided to go back to the north. She talked about how the process of decision making, when you know that every decision could end up getting you killed, no matter what you do, you don't know what is going to be the thing. Do you flee? Do you stay? Do you try to go north? Do you stay where you are? And just she describes the process of trying to make that momentous decision, and it's just devastating. It's absolutely devastating. So yeah, Nora, you wanted to, and again, reacting. I mean, what you're saying, Laila. Of course, we know the US could do this kind of investigation, could do much more with its resources, but they've made a decision to allow this genocide to proceed, to assist it, and not to ask too many questions about it.
Right. And along with that is the corporate media that, you know, I mean, there is irrefutable evidence now that at least 355 rounds were pumped into the car that killed Hind Rajab and her family. And it has yet to be reported by, you know, the so-called paper of record, of course, the New York Times and any other media outlets. I mean, how do we even, you know, and then as you said, like Matt Miller, you know, is saying, oh, we've asked the Israelis to investigate themselves. That's what he says every single day up there. I mean, how do we even assess the level of gaslighting that is being perpetuated not just by the Israelis and their media apparatus, but echoed and parroted and supported by the US and its media apparatus?
You know, one thing that stands out to me in the process of making The Night Won't End is this execution that we feature in our film is not the only reported execution in that area at that time. There were at least two other stories of executions of two other families, the Khalidi family and the Kilani family, within just a few days span in mid-December. We weren't able to report those out, unfortunately, just due to limitations of time. But I spoke with a local journalist in Gaza, and I said, because he had reported on the Khalidi execution, and he was telling me everybody he spoke with. And he said, you know, the neighbor said he heard something. And I said, oh, did you interview the neighbor? He said, no, I didn't interview the neighbor because he didn't see anything. He only heard. And it made me think, wow, if only the New York Times journalists who reported on alleged mass rape in an article that they put on the front page that ended up completely falling apart and yet remains on their website had the ethics of this journalist who said, I did not interview him because he didn't see anything, he only heard. Imagine.
Yeah.
And yet these journalists in Gaza are totally, you know, demonized, discredited, dismissed as unreliable narrators of their own mass killing. There's a complete lack of solidarity with them in the face of this record number of, you know, journalists killed and targeted, as well as their families. And, you know, it's just galling. And I agree. I mean, the mainstream media, for the most part, there's exceptions here and there, has failed in the coverage of what's happening in Gaza. Sometimes it's failed because of not covering stories, and other times it's failed, and failed almost seems like too gentle, because it's been outright complicit in the propaganda campaign in terms of pushing out official Israeli narratives.
Should we take a look at, there's a clip, I believe you're referring to the Salem family, the execution, and this was just utterly harrowing sequence. It really brought back to my mind, I remember now 42 years ago, I was a child, but the images from Sabra and Shatila refugee camps that were in Time magazine and Newsweek, and I remember going over again and again and looking at them, and are indelibly marked in my mind. And these images that we saw, these were video, not still images of the bodies, reminded me so much of that. But why don't we take a clip of, take a look at the clip, Tamara, focusing on the Salem family.
معهم كل الإمكانيات وأنت مدني أعزل، لا تملك إشي وما سويت حاجة، وبلحظة إنه ينعدم أغلب قرايبك. عمي وابن عمي وكان جوز أختي من نار العشري، وكان في برضه اللي هو ولاد أختي اللي هو أولاد الشهيد مستشهد فيهم. فقلت أنا أخويا أمين الله يرحمه أكبر مني بسنتين، ما له أي دعوة لا في مقاومة ولا بضرب طلب. ما ظنيت إن في بني آدم يعني ممكن ينسى موقف زي هيك.
The Israeli military did not reply to questions regarding the attack.
And that, just for those who are listening, that was one of the survivors of the massacre, standing in the apartment. He's filmed in the apartment where the massacre takes place, and he's actually showing us where it happened and how it happened. It's part of a longer sequence. We, of course, are not going to play the video that shows the aftermath of the massacre here, but it is in your film. And then he's listing, as the photos show of his family members in happier times, he's listing all the members of his family who were murdered, executed in cold blood in this massacre. The men were stripped down, executed with gunshots to the head, the worst possible atrocity imaginable. And he goes through all the members of his family who were murdered in that massacre. Laila, what can you tell us about just your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I haven't gotten this massacre out of my head since I first heard about it. And sitting and transcribing the interviews was like this out-of-body experience. I remember this one, it was like a Friday night, and my children were in their martial arts class. It's not taekwondo, they do a different kind, but they were in their martial arts class, and I was like in the office where they do martial arts, like transcribing this interview, and I just felt like, what is this world we live in, where I'm in this martial arts class and I'm listening to literal scenes out of a horror movie. I mean, what happened to the Salem family is like the worst possible horror movie you can, like literally it's worse than a horror movie, worse than anything a horror movie director or writer can think of. And it was just this, you know, I think in some ways it was kind of this moment where I think a lot of us have felt this, which is like we're here, we're in our lives, we're able to somehow, you know, eat and sleep and and live in this safety, especially if you're Palestinian and you just feel like that could have been me, that could have been my family. And I think one detail that hasn't left my mind is Uday, who's the other survivor. We saw Yahya in this clip, but Uday is another young man. And both of them say, they're like, we don't know how we're alive. The soldiers thought they were dead. They both passed out. So it's very likely the soldiers thought they were dead. And that's the only way they were able to survive. But Uday talks about how his father, Ayman, and I went back and I looked at Ayman's Facebook page, and there's something so eerie about looking at someone's Facebook page after they've been killed in this horrific way. His last post was like about the last Ramadan in 2023, and just all of his photos and, you know, under a tree, smiling, like he just lived this like totally normal life and just seemed like such a sweet man. His family talks about him making like falafel for them for dinner. You know, they just lived this really simple life as a family, and they took him up a flight of stairs and told him to knock on the neighbor's door and make up some lie or some story to get the neighbors to come out. Basically at gunpoint, they took him to do this. He didn't want to, but he did. He told them, you know, he said whatever he needed to say. And then apparently after that, they pushed him and threw him down the flight of stairs. And there's something about that detail of him being pushed down a flight of stairs that just like hasn't, you know, just made me completely just start like sobbing. Just to think of this man and like the way that they take away your dignity, your life. They did all this in front of his family. You know, you mentioned like they stripped them down to their boxers. They made the women strip. Just talk about sexual abuse, right? Talk about humiliation. The way that they humiliated these people, and these families just kept saying over and over again, we're civilians, we're civilians. And I can tell you what ties all of these stories together is that there is no innocent Palestinians for the Israeli military that's operating in Gaza. They knew these people were civilians. One of the survivors told us that they'd been shelled and attacked and besieged for 5 days leading up to this massacre. And she said, you know, we couldn't use the bathroom, we couldn't eat, we couldn't drink water because they were like surrounding them and just shooting at them. And she said, no one ever fought back. They knew who we were. And yet they came in and they acted in this, you know, inhumane, horrific, I mean, there's just no words, monstrous, savage, barbaric way. And I think, you know, we obtained two very graphic, disturbing videos of the aftermath of that massacre, where you actually can see the men unclothed in their bodies after they'd been executed. We show one of the videos, but I felt very strongly that, and I kept pushing for this, but that we were going to see them as they were living as well. I didn't want the men to just be bodies. I wanted the audience to see that these were people and they had loved ones who are mourning them and grieving them and missing them. And that's why we had that sequence with their photos, because I wanted everyone to know who those bodies were. And the last thing I wanted to say is, I just lost my thought because I was just thinking about that point of making sure the audience knew who these men were. But unfortunately, I don't think our film even skims the surface of the crimes that have taken place in Gaza. I think there are many, many, many atrocities that have happened, and executions and war crimes that have taken place that we don't even know about. And I hope they come to light at some point. And it's not the lack of trying of the journalists on the ground. They're doing their best, but there's only so much they can cover. And they're also being systematically targeted and killed. But yeah, sorry, that was a long answer.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's what you were saying about, you know, us who are so far away, and you know, there's this disconnect. It's a very surreal feeling of, yeah, taking care of your kids, going to work, going to the grocery store, going to a baseball game, things that are just, you know, considered normal life here. And then also working, you know, with your colleagues who are going through the most unspeakable time.
I want to say one thing about that.
Yeah.
That day that I transcribed that interview, I just started sobbing, like I said, and sorry.
Yeah.
Sometimes I felt like as a mom, I wasn't present at all, because how do you hear stuff like that and then just be normal? But I'd just been crying so much, and I was leaving, you know, the martial arts place, and this mom just looks at me and she's like, "Are you okay?" And, you know, all I could say is like, you know, Gaza. And then she just says, "Oh, why? Do you have family there?" And I don't know why. There's just something about that question that triggered me so much, because I'm like, those weren't my family, but I'm so upset.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to have family or be personally connected to be appalled and horrified about what's happening there. And I just, you know, all I could say is like, no, this is about humanity. You know, obviously I do have family there, but that this is just about people, anybody. It doesn't have to be your family member. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
That really bothers me.
Absolutely. And there's also this way in which, and I think your film does an incredible job of counteracting this, where Palestinians are, if they're thought of at all in mainstream discourse, in the narrative, and in the corporate media, they're just kind of hapless victims, and they're not afforded the dignity of telling their story and of understanding their full humanity as parents, as teachers, as doctors, as resistance fighters, even. And I think that it's so important, the way that you re-dignified these people who are trying to survive. Just, I mean, day after day. You know, I keep thinking about the massacres that happened in Beit Lahia earlier today, right? And how these people had probably survived countless other massacres somehow. And today, almost 9 months into this, they're trapped under rubble. They didn't survive this one. I mean, how do we even begin to process the scale of this?
Yeah, I mean, one detail that we couldn't include in the film is that some of the people who survived that massacre on December 19th were killed in airstrikes during Ramadan. And it just, like, when I found that out, I was just like, how do you survive something like that December 19th massacre and see your loved ones be killed like that and humiliated and be beaten and injured and all of that? And then they were killed in airstrikes later. And, you know, one woman I spoke with, she had, I believe, 8 children. 5 of them were killed.
Jesus.
So she had 3 sons and her husband killed on December 19th. And then she had 2 daughters killed in an airstrike during Ramadan. And she told me, you know, I asked her, how old are you? And she said, you know, she's in her late 40s. And she said, I was so young when I became a mom, when I got married. I grew up with my children. And now, you know, she's lost most of them. She lost her husband. And I should say that these people who spoke with us also are so courageous, because a lot of them are convinced that if they speak to the media, they're going to be killed by the Israeli military, that they're going to be targeted. And I pray to God that doesn't happen. But there's a lot of fear about speaking about, especially about these atrocities, a lot of fear. I can't even tell you.
Yeah.
And it's justified. I mean, it's justified fear, and I think it puts all of us in the position also of worrying about, if we speak with someone, if we interview someone, are we endangering them potentially? And I think the answer to that is that it is their choice, but you know, nobody takes these decisions lightly, and you have to give people that opportunity, and also not do it lightly. Also talk to them, make sure that there is that certainty. But people do feel compelled to speak and tell what happened. And I think what you did, Laila, with this film, you and your colleagues, is, I think as Nora said it, you gave people back the dignity which Israel has stolen from them. And we see that in like just the fact that people are not able to have proper funerals in Gaza. Even those whose bodies are recovered, people are being buried in medians in the middle of roads because there's no space. They're being buried in makeshift graves. People cannot hold a condolences to receive people to give condolences. People are robbed of all the rituals that provide dignity and comfort and support for the family in the midst of this genocide. And it was striking, the dignity with which everyone spoke in the film and the way you showed them. And that is very moving and very important. And yesterday I was reading Gaza Writes Back, the book edited by our dear friend Laila Al-Arian, longtime former contributor to the electronic Intifada, who was murdered by Israel on December 6th. And it's reading it, it's almost prescient, where he talks about there's almost sort of a fatalism that death will come for you in Gaza. It's everywhere. And yet people are still determined to live and to tell their stories. And he says that the way we fight back against this is to tell the stories. And just watching your film while next to reading Rifat's words, you really did justice to his invocation. And I just want to say personally, I can't thank you enough for it, as difficult as it is to do. It's so vital.
Thank you. I mean, it feels like it's the absolute least we can do, given what people are going through. And, I think we live in a society that's constantly telling us that we should accept Palestinian, the dehumanization of Palestinians. But I remind myself that if all of this was happening to other people, it would be front page news. We would be getting alerts on our phones. People would care. People would express outrage. Ali, what you mentioned about where people are being buried, or the lack of being able to have funerals, or all of that would be a story. It's like we're just being told every single day from every lever of power in our society that like this is something that's just normal, right? Palestinians starving to death, normal. Palestinians being executed in cold blood, normal. All of this. And I think it's our job, every fiber of our being needs to just absolutely reject that and say it's not normal, and we're going to be sounding the alarm. And every single journalist should feel the exact same way and should do their jobs, frankly, just like they would cover anything else.
And yeah. the thing that I wanted, I also lost the thread of something I wanted to say when I was reading Rifat's words, and he would go on with others, with Ahmed and Naouq and Rami Abdu and the many, many young people they worked with in Gaza, and the volunteers in the United States and other countries to found We Are Not Numbers, to tell this story. The title of the project, We Are Not Numbers. And those words really struck me as so appropriate in watching this film, because it is so easy, even for us as Palestinians, to start to think of the victims in Gaza as numbers. We say 37,000, 38,000, 40,000. It becomes abstract. It becomes impossible to absorb what these numbers mean. And telling their stories, giving people the chance to speak. While this is happening, as you said, Laila, they are still living through the genocide, surviving through the genocide. And the reality no one can hide, is the people that we see in the film interviewed may not be there in a week. I'm not saying something that they don't know. And that's what screamed out for me. We are not numbers. They are not numbers. And the enormity of the crimes can only really be, in our limited human brains, can only be absorbed when we look at individual stories of individuals and families in depth. And you did it with such power. You did it with such power.
Thank you. I do think there's a power in like the specificity of naming a family, you know, naming everybody we see and seeing, you know, their life before everything happened. I thought this was a choice of the director, my colleague Kavitha Shukuru, to start the film with the sea and sort of how Hiba and her family like to spend their time when they wanted to relax and have fun as a family. And I just thought that was so humanizing and so beautiful and so relatable. And like I said, I think we just live in an environment, in a society that wants us to think that that's not the experience of Palestinians, and we need to like push back against that as much as possible.
Laila Al-Arian, you are an award-winning journalist and the executive producer of Fault Lines. The film, again, is called The Night Won't End, and people can find that on YouTube. It was just age restricted, of course. So it's going to be really important. Yeah. Sorry?
It'll be a little bit harder to find, but
harder to find, but all the more important for people to find it and share it, and you know, organize watch parties, and you know, anything you can do. It's super important. So The Night Won't End. We also have a direct link on ASA's blog post that was published earlier this week. Laila, thank you for all of your work. And can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, Laila.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on Donate Now. Thank you.